The sun hung low in the sky, painting the landscape an ominous shade of orange. The air crackled with tension, almost like a storm was brewing. Old Man Jenkins stood on his porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed as he surveyed the distant horizon. He could feel it. Change was coming, and it wasn't the kind of change he welcomed. Just a few days earlier, a glossy black SUV had pulled up to the edge of his property, and two sharply dressed men emerged. They strolled toward his gate with an air of authority, briefcases in hand. Confidence radiated from them, a confidence born from wealth and power. They looked like wolves dressed in the finest sheep's clothing. Jenkins knew instantly they were there to take what was his. He had worked too hard and too long for these men to come in and try to sweep it away like fallen leaves. "Greetings, Mr. Jenkins," one of the men had said, as slick as oil. "I represent Global Acres. We're very interested in your land." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They talked about progress, modernization, and the bright future of the town. But to Jenkins, it sounded like a death sentence for the only home he had ever known. He returned to the porch, his jaw clenched, remembering stories whispered by his father about the greedy land developers back in the 60s. They'd come through the valley with promises and contracts, only to leave families broken and towns abandoned. Jenkins refused to let that happen to him. As night fell, he thought over his options, weighing them in the quiet of his old farmhouse. The floorboards creaked under his weight, reminding him of every life lived within those walls, every meal shared, and every laugh that echoed through the years. Memories flickered through his mind like an old film reel: his son sliding down the banister, his wife calling him in for dinner, the warmth of fireside stories shared with grandchildren. He wouldn't let anyone take that away. He knew he had to act. The following morning, he donned his weathered flannel shirt, the one that had absorbed the sweat and toil of decades. He shuffled out to the fields, feeling the cool earth under his worn boots. He had his plow and a few old tractors, but more than that, he had a deep connection to this land that no amount of money could replace. He started to work, tilling the soil, letting the sun warm his back. He poured his heart and grit into each furrow, ready to defend what was rightfully his. As days turned into weeks, the black SUV returned, accompanied by more expensive vehicles and a small army of suited men. They held meetings, looming over maps and proposals, discussing how they could turn his farm into a sprawling complex of warehouses and storefronts. Jenkins could see the plans unfold before his eyes, his fields replaced by concrete and steel, his ancestral home reduced to a mere footnote in the history of progress. But that was not going to happen. With each visit from the developers, Jenkins grew bolder. He began attending town meetings, talking to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the land's history, of its roots, of the countless families who'd come before him and cultivated it with care. He reminded folks that the essence of their community lay in the farms that nurtured their past and their future. Slowly, he kindled the spirit of resistance in those around him. He asked an audience that had once stayed silent. The townspeople began to rally, and soon, a movement blossomed. Rather than just be a farmer defending his field, Jenkins became a symbol, a standard-bearer for everyone who loved their home. People joined him, bringing homemade banners and posters. Save Jenkins' Farm and Community Over Corporations brought life and color to the town square. The tide began to turn. One evening, Jenkins stood surrounded by friends and neighbors, the sunset casting a golden glow around them. A palpable energy charged the air, lifting their spirits. They were ready to act together, but they needed a plan. Jenkins laid out his strategy, meticulously crafted through weeks of brainstorming. With pens poised, each person marked their commitment to fight as one. With newfound resolve, they organized town hall events, sharing testimonies from those affected by similar takeovers. They reached out to local media, garnering attention from passionate journalists who believed in their cause. Warriors of sorts, they gathered the community into a force that could no longer be ignored. Weeks morphed into months as the developers found themselves on the back foot. They underestimated the cumulative strength of a community galvanized by love for their home. While Jenkins dug deep into the earth, his neighbors cultivated a rich tapestry of support and awareness. But the developers had money on their side. They unleashed a heavy wave of advertisements promising jobs and economic growth. They proclaimed, they plastered the local radio waves with assurances that Jenkins was simply holding back progress. Doubt began to creep into the hearts of some townsfolk. One quiet evening, a longtime friend named Earl approached Jenkins, fear etched across his face. "Old friend, maybe it's time to reconsider. They're offering good money." Jenkins gazed into his eyes, searching for the man he knew so well, the one who had shared endless nights of laughter around the fire. "Earl, this isn't just about land. It's about our roots, about our stories. If we let them have it, what would be left for our children?" Silence reigned, and for a moment the weight of those words hung heavily between them. Earl's shoulders slumped. "You're right, Jim." Jenkins nodded, determination hardened in his chest. They would fight tooth and nail. The following week, during a town council meeting, it became a clash of wills. Thumps of uncertainty collided with roars of defiance. Jenkins stood tall, his voice resonating through the dim hall. He shared stories of the families who relied on him, the children who played in the fields, the history entwined within the soil beneath their feet. The words fell like rain on parched earth, watering the roots of the audience's conviction. They too began to share their own stories, tales of love, tradition, and lasting connections, all thrown into question by the insatiable hunger for profit. As the meeting unfolded, tension stretched like a taut string ready to snap. At last, the developers unleashed their final gambit, a slick performance from a seasoned lawyer, manipulating facts and tossing around fancy terminology. But in the end, it was Jenkins' authenticity that caught fire in the hearts of the townsfolk. A wave began to ripple through the crowd as people rallied behind him. "Our fight isn't just legal," Jenkins cried. At the end of the night, the council voted to halt the development plans, if only temporarily. Cheers erupted, and the feeling of triumph rang in the air. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Jenkins felt the warmth of community wrap around him, igniting hope that they could defend what they loved the most. But the battle wasn't over. The developers regrouped, more determined than ever to conquer Jenkins and the community. They filed appeals, demanding formal studies, asserting that the land was ideally suited for the proposed project. They threatened to exhaust the town with a legal battle that could stretch on for years. Every time they sent another pile of paperwork, Jenkins felt his heartbeat quicken. The fatigue of the fight began creeping in, but each evening, the warmth of his home and the memories within it fueled him. One particularly cold night, he sat staring into the flickering flames of his fireplace, pondering whether he could keep going on his own. But then he felt it, a sense of undeniable strength within him, the legacy of his ancestors flaring up, fierce and fiery. He reached for his old guitar, an instrument that held years of memories, with songs woven from heartache and hope. Strumming each chord, he sang softly under the stars, transporting himself back to simpler times. The power within that moment saw him through the darkness, a reminder that sometimes the heart must lead the way. The next morning, he gathered the town. He called a meeting, ready to unveil a plan that would surround their community with powerful unity. Together, they crafted a campaign that spotlighted the historic value of their land art projects. Local testimonies and community gardening days sprung to life. They painted murals that captured their shared history, reminding everyone who passed what they were truly fighting for. It worked. With every creative expression, every shared story, they began to garner the attention of not just the locals but also the state. Soon, local organizations started to take notice, rallying experts and advocates to support their cause. The attention tangled around the lawsuit like vines, and the developers found themselves on a shaky platform. At the next town council meeting, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Jenkins stood up, flanked by neighbors ready to stand their ground. He began to speak about resilience, community, and the power of preserving their heritage. The crowd was fiery in spirit, lawyers and advocates ready to counter any sleight of hand the developers attempted. Then came the moment of reckoning. With newfound empowerment, Jenkins and his community faced the developers and their endless legal jargon head-on. The tension reached a peak as the local representatives stood in solidarity, declaring that the people had a right to protect their land from encroachment. The decision arrived like the stroke of thunder, echoing through the hall and sending shockwaves of disbelief across the room. "The proposal for development is denied," boomed the mayor's voice. A unified cheer erupted, shaking the walls, vibrating through the souls of those present. Jenkins's heart swelled. He looked around and saw not just his neighbors but a vibrant community standing tall. Witnessing the determination, he realized they had weathered more than just a battle over land. They had reclaimed their identity, their power, and their future. As more days stretched into weeks, news outlets carried the victory far beyond their little town. The world was watching, inspired by the struggle of a community that refused to yield. Local farmers found new connections with each other, understanding that the shared love for their land tied them together like roots underground. Old Man Jenkins had become a legend, a modern-day David striking back against the Goliath of corporate greed. But his heart knew it wasn't truly about becoming a figure of folklore. It was about all of them. It was about life, history, and preserving the map of who they were. Years later, neighbors would gather on that same porch, sharing stories, laughter, and nostalgia, while clouds draped the evening sky like soft blankets. The fields surrounding them were alive in a tapestry of green, thick with growth and joy. And as Old Man Jenkins listened to the symphony of crickets singing in the warm night air, he smiled. They thought they could take the farm, but they hadn't counted on the heart of a community refusing to give up. He had stood firm, rooted in love and memories, proving that sometimes the fight is not just for land but for a way of life that connects generations together. The morning mist lingered in the air like an uninvited guest, wrapping around the old wooden farmhouse as Henry Jenkins stepped onto his porch. The day seemed ordinary, but he could feel the shifting winds of change. It crept under his skin, sending little shivers down his spine. He'd been up before sunrise, tending to his cattle and surveying the land he'd loved since he was a boy. The roots of this farm ran deep, entwined with his heart, his history, and his family. But today was different. Today felt charged. As he sipped his coffee, the hot brew grounding him, his eyes fell on a sleek black SUV rolling down the dirt road toward his gate. It looked out of place in the rustic landscape, and something about it felt sinister, like a shadow creeping into the sunlight. He set down his mug, brow furrowing in concern. Everyone knew the unspoken rule of the county. Farmers stood together, opposing any encroachment on their lands. But Henry's instincts told him this visit might test those bonds. The SUV grumbled to a halt and two sharply dressed men emerged. They strolled toward the gate, confidence radiating from every step, as if they owned the very ground beneath them. Henry stepped off the porch, squaring his shoulders, ready to confront whatever scheme they brought. "Mister," one of them called, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "We represent Greenfield Development. We'd like to discuss your property." Henry clenched his fists, the warmth of his coffee long forgotten. It was simple, direct, and the only answer he needed to give. The man's smile faltered, though he quickly recovered. "But sir, think of the future. We could turn this farm into a thriving community complex. This isn't just land, it's my family history. My way of life," Henry shot back, voice steady and resolute. They exchanged glances, the men calculating their next move. Finally, the second man leaned in slightly. "Let's be clear. We don't actually care about your feelings on this. We're prepared to make an offer you'll find hard to refuse." Henry challenged. The weight of his ancestors pressed on his shoulders, filling him with a fierce resolve. He could feel the land beneath his feet, alive with memories of generations past. The men whispered among themselves before breaking away with a shrug. "Take your time." With that, they retreated to their vehicle, leaving Henry with the echo of their words and a sharp sense of foreboding. Night deepened around the farmhouse, and the ache of uncertainty gnawed at Henry as he sat by the fire, a thick journal of farm records open on his lap. It was where he meticulously tracked every seed sown, every cow born, every storm weathered. The journal held the heartbeat of his farm, his life woven through ink and paper. He whispered to the fire as if it could answer. He recalled stories his grandfather told him about land grabs developers swooping in during the night, leaving families with nothing. The old tales were meant to inspire vigilance, but would he be able to protect his legacy? Could he stand up against the promises and power of the suits? As sleep finally closed in, he dreamt of the fields overflowing with golden wheat dancing in the sun. But shadows flickered at the edges, dark figures taking what was not theirs, tearing up the land he loved. He jolted awake, heart racing, realizing with dread that the battle had only just begun. The next day was filled with determination. The sun shone brightly, mocking the anxiety that twisted his gut. He reached out to neighbors, gathering them in the barn. They were a varied bunch. Some were seniors with stories to share, but they all shared one thing: love for the land. "We need to stand together," Henry urged, his voice strong. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the barn, uniting those present with a collective sense of purpose. They spent hours devising a plan, sharing resources and connections. Word spread quickly, and soon, a wave of support began to swell. Locals rallied around the idea of saving the farm, fighting against the seemingly unbreakable grip of corporate greed. Days turned into a week, and the community transformed. People painted signs on their barns, held rallies in town, and broadcast their commitment through social media. A young girl named Lily baked cookies, selling them to fund their fight. A retired lawyer, Mrs. Hendricks, offered her knowledge of property rights, becoming a fierce advocate for their cause. But with each rally, each gathering, the tension edged higher. The world outside the town remained oblivious, but for Henry and his neighbors, it felt like the storm was building, ready to unleash its fury. Finally, the developers returned, this time with an air of impatience, looking less like corporate giants and more like cornered animals. Henry prepared, knowing he had to make a presence. The hall buzzed with anxious chatter, filled with community members young and old, each face a testament to resilience. As the meeting began, emotions bubbled to the surface. The representatives from Greenfield Development spoke slickly, masking their intentions behind technical jargon that felt both foreign and intimidating. Henry sat silently, observing the ebb and flow. The lies dripped like poison through the air. When they finally turned to him, their expressions a mix of condescension and mockery, he felt a fire ignite within. "Let me remind you, gentlemen," he said, standing tall as the room fell silent. "This isn't just land to us. It is a home, a legacy." The room erupted into applause, a wave of energy crashing over the developers, who tried to diffuse the tension by belittling Henry's claims, labeling them emotional and sentimental. But the warmth of community pushed back, filling the hall with a strength he hadn't realized was there. The night concluded with heated debates and unexpected confrontations, the tension a tangible force in the air. A vote was called, and in that moment Henry's heart raced. They would either stand together or crumble under the weight of ambition. Finally, the results were announced. A unanimous no echoed through the chambers, reverberating off the walls. Old eyes sparkled with relief, hands gripped each other tightly, and Henry felt a sense of triumph swell within him. But that victory was short-lived. The developers shifted their strategy, employing a legal team powerful enough to intimidate the town. They filed suit, claiming that the local government couldn't block their development proposal. The battle was escalating, taking a dangerous turn. Henry felt the weight of despair creep in as they faced legal proceedings that dragged on. Days turned into weeks, pulling communities into the intricate, tedious world of paperwork and delayed court dates. Lives became entangled around the anticipation of results, each email an anxiety-inducing moment. Despite the overwhelming odds, Henry never lost faith in their fight. Each evening, he gathered the community, sharing stories, lifting spirits, weaving laughter through despair. One night, as they huddled around a fire, a local musician strummed an emotional melody. It reminded them all of what they were fighting for, reigniting the flame of unity and purpose. Then came the day of the big court hearing. The tension simmered in the air as they filed into the small courthouse, filled with nervous energy. Henry's heart raced as he glanced around at the faces, each familiar, each filled with hope. There was Mrs. Hendricks, Lily with a hopeful glimmer in her eyes, and farmers standing firm, ready to support him. As the judge entered, a hush fell over the room. The courtroom filled with electricity as lawyers strutted their rhetoric, exchanging arguments built on loopholes and contracts. Tension coiled tight, but it was the people's testimonies that packed the emotional punch. Henry stood to speak, heart pounding in his chest. This isn't about property lines. It's about life, heritage, and our future. This land has fed generations. His words flew like arrows, piercing through the corporate defense. The older generations nodded, and even those skeptical were rekindled. After hours of back and forth, the judge finally paused, contemplating the evidence before him. Moments stretched like hours, a palpable silence hanging heavily. And then, just like that, the gavel struck. "The proposal is denied," the judge declared, a somber finality echoing through the room. Euphoria exploded, cheers erupted, tears streamed down faces, and a collective relief washed over the crowd like a tide. Once outside, the air felt electric with celebration. They embraced, clapping backs and wiping tears, laughing and dancing in the streets. Henry knew deep down it wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up for each other, about love, community, and holding onto the heart of what made their lives meaningful. But even as they celebrated, Henry felt the weight of uncertainty lingering. The developers wouldn't retreat easily. It was clear the battle wasn't over yet. Over the following weeks, shadowy figures were spotted on the edges of the farm, lurking in the dark. Employees from Greenfield began to take subtle actions, harassing neighbors and planting seeds of worry. Patiently and quietly, they picked away at the resolve of some townsfolk, whispering about profits and economic growth. The community would gather, growing smaller with uncertainty as fears crept into their hearts. The whispers spread, and emotion pulsed through the group like a fever, more like a distant memory of a fight well fought than a tangible, ongoing battle. "I just don't know if we can keep going," one farmer admitted, looking around the circle of friends. Henry felt the cold grip of doubt squeeze his chest, but he refused to let despair wash over him. "We've come too far to give in to fear. We have to remember why we started this fight." His words cracked through the anxiety, igniting something in those who had begun to falter. Day by day, they reclaimed their sense of purpose, reminding each other of the roots that bound them together. They formed a plan again, a new strategy to raise awareness and galvanize their community. Lily, now firmly belting out melodies at local events, shared her passion for preserving the land through music, drawing in more support. Mrs. Hendricks began organizing peaceful protests, and soon, the town gathered signs proclaiming their love of the farm and the refusal to let anything take it from them. The fire of resistance lived again, flickering brighter as if the land itself was rekindling their spirits. As weeks passed, the developers returned, this time accompanied by a crew for inspections. But the townsfolk were ready. A barricade of neighbors stood firm, armed with signs, voices raised, hearts beating as one. They shouted, the force of their community uniting like a wall of hope and strength. Witnesses arrived as the confrontation intensified. Even the local news picked up the story. And it was then, in that moment of collective defiance, that the tide turned. As cameras rolled and voices rose, the people of the town began to draw in others. Passers-by stopped to look. Locals began to gather with shared frustration. An energy they'd built surged through each person, fueling the fire inside. What Henry saw wasn't just anger, but a beautiful display of love for their heritage. They would not back down. They would not let their home vanish into the shadows. The developers, witnessing the overwhelming support, realized they had underestimated the resolve of a bonded community. Their plans began to unravel, the tight grip of intimidation slipping through their fingers. In the shadow of the old barn, Henry stood tall, surrounded by friends and neighbors, ready to defend their unity against corporate greed. They each forged a piece of their heart to the land, turning it into a force unwilling to retreat. As weeks turned into an undeniable momentum, the community rallied behind one another, realizing that together they were a force to be reckoned with. Fear transformed into strength, and the old farmhouse, once a battleground of uncertainty, became a sacred gathering place. On a bright day under the wide sky, while wildflowers danced in the breeze, Henry stepped onto his porch once more. As he looked out across the fields, he felt the warmth of hope flourish in his chest. He could almost hear the whispers of his ancestors, urging him onward. They thought they could take the farm, but sometimes they just didn't understand the power of a united heart, the strength of community with roots reaching deep into the soil, where life blooms brighter than any corporate scheme could ever imagine. The morning fog hung low over the fields, wrapping the old farmhouse in a shroud of mystery. Henry Jenkins stood on his porch, sipping coffee, and felt a strange stirring in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the chill in the air. Something in the atmosphere felt heavy, almost electric. The land whispered to him, every rustle of leaves echoing memories of generations past. Today was different, and he knew it. Just as he turned to head back inside, a sleek black SUV rumbled down the dirt road, its tires kicking up dust from the well-trodden path. As it came to a stop, Henry's instincts sharpened. The vehicle seemed out of place in the rustic landscape, an imposing symbol of something dark creeping into the light. Two sharply dressed men climbed out, confidence radiating from their every step. They approached with an air that screamed entitlement, briefcases clasped tightly, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Henry's heart quickened. He had heard whispers in town, rumors about big developers sniffing around, hungry for land to swallow whole. "Mister," the taller man's voice was smooth, deceptively friendly. "We're with Greenfield Developments." Henry straightened, determination hardening his resolve. "I'm not interested," he stated simply. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "But sir, think of the investment. This place, it has untapped potential. We could turn this farm into a thriving complex." Henry clenched his fists, the warmth of his coffee forgot. "This is my family's land. It's not just dirt and crops." The second man stepped forward, his gaze cold and calculated. "You might want to reconsider. We could make you an offer that's hard to turn down." Henry felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. The old tales his grandfather told raced through his mind, stories of families losing their farms to merciless developers, the land they loved torn apart piece by piece. Rage bubbled within him. He would not let it happen. "Get off my property," he shouted, voice steady. The SUV's men exchanged glances, their confidence cracking just a bit, but they retreated without another word. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse slipped into shadows, but inside, Henry's mind was ablaze. He had spent years working these fields, his entire life entwined with the land. Memories filled his heart, family dinners around the big oak table, rain-soaked days planting seeds alongside his father, children laughing under the summer sun in the yard. No amount of money could replace that. He knew he had to act. The following morning, Henry gathered his neighbors at the barn, their faces illuminated by the soft light filtering through the cracks. He stood at the front, feeling the weight of their expectations resting heavily on his shoulders. "We've got trouble," he said, clearing his throat. "The developers are coming for our land. They think this farm is just a piece of property to be bought and sold." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, gathering momentum. A voice called out from the back. "We stand together," Henry replied, conviction in his voice. "We defend our roots, our heritage. We can't let them divide us." He proposed a plan. They would raise awareness, hold meetings, and bring the fight to the community. Fearful glances turned into determined expressions, and the rallying cry echoed off the barn walls. Weeks passed as the farmers organized rallies, made signs, and shared stories. Their movement grew, fueled by the bond of shared purpose. They wrote letters to the local newspaper, and radio stations began to pick up on the story. An underdog tale of a community fighting back against the Goliath of corporate greed. Yet with each passing day, the developers loomed larger. They countered with slick advertisements, talking about jobs and progress, trying to chip away at the townspeople's resolve. One chilly evening, as the sunset painted the sky, Henry felt doubt creeping in again. Could they really win this fight? His phone buzzed misses. Hendricks, a retired teacher and a favorite among the townsfolk, was calling. "Henry, we need to have a meeting," she said, her voice steady. "Some are wavering. They've been approached with promises." The next day they gathered in the town hall, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Henry felt a knot of anxiety as he took center stage. "Folks, we've come too far to back down now. This is bigger than us." Emotions surged through the crowd. Eyes shone with determination and hands gripped the backs of chairs tightly. One by one, neighbors began to speak, sharing their stories, how their parents had fought for the land, how they themselves had built their lives here. Each testimony pushed back against the creeping despair, igniting a flame of collective spirit. Henry felt the energy shift in the room. "They may have money, but we have something they will never understand," he said, voice steady. "We have roots." As the meeting filled with applause and support, Henry felt the collective strength envelop him, a palpable force revitalizing his spirit. They weren't just fighting for a piece of land. They were standing up for their way of life, for the stories etched into the soil. But the developers were relentless, re-strategizing and planning their next move. As the legal battle unfolded, they filed thick stacks of paperwork, draining resources and wearing the community down. Anxiety began to seep back into the group, eroding the momentum they had built together. Some began to whisper about giving up. One evening, while sitting on his porch, Henry watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A soft breeze rustled through the grass, but he wasn't at peace. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach and the shadows of anxiety creeping back in. Then his grandson, Ben, came bounding up the porch steps, his eyes sparkling with innocence. "Grandpa, can we plant seeds tomorrow?" A smile creased Henry's face as the boy bounded into the house, bringing light with him. Suddenly, a spark ignited in Henry's heart. If he could instill that same spirit in the community, maybe they could push through this together. The next day, inspired by Ben's enthusiasm, Henry called for another community meeting, but this time it was different. He proposed a day of planting, a day to celebrate their land. Response was unwavering. Neighbors brought their kids, tools, and seeds, transforming the event into a festival of life. Laughter and chatter filled the air as families gathered under the sun, planting seeds together. Henry called out the atmosphere buoyant. He watched as children, grandparents, and neighbors worked side by side, embodying the essence of community. As they dug into the earth, hope bloomed anew. That evening, Henry stood back and gazed over the freshly planted field, boundless and vibrant. He knew then that they could defeat the darkness together, that the love for their home ran deeper than any developer could understand. But their battle was far from over. The developers returned, this time armed with intimidation tactics. They strolled through the newly planted fields like kings surveying their territory, making threats that surfaced in hushed tones among townsfolk. "They won't stop coming," whispered Mrs. Hendricks, her eyes worried. Determined, Henry rallied the townspeople again, igniting their resolve once more. "They may try to divide us, but look to your neighbors." They held another community meeting, and Henry laid out their plan. They would confront the developers directly, united as one. He proclaimed, fire illuminating his words. On the day of the confrontation, the atmosphere crackled with tension. They gathered at the town hall, bodies packed tightly, a collective force. As the developers entered, armed with their polished confidence and legal jargon, the townsfolk stood firm, resolute. "Mister," a local news crew exclaimed from the corner. Cameras flashed, capturing the essence of a small-town David standing against a corporate Goliath. Henry stepped forward, words spilling forth like a waterfall. "This is more than land. Their development proposal isn't about progress, it's a threat to our way of life." His voice turned to a rallying cry, echoing through the room, reinforcing the spirit of resistance that had grown in the hearts of his neighbors. They were no longer just fighting for a farm. They were fighting for generations, for a legacy, and for the right to choose their own path. As the conversation escalated, it became clear that the developers hadn't fully grasped the power of community. They found themselves outmatched by passion and unity. The tension unfolded over hours, each moment a chess match in a game of wills. Finally, the head developer challenged Henry directly. "This is a losing battle, old man." But Henry stood firm, undaunted. "We may not have your money, but we have something far more valuable." With that statement, the crowd erupted in cheers, solidarity pulsating through every corner of the room. The developer's confident facade shattered, revealing uncertainty behind his eyes. Days passed, and the community eagerly awaited the judge's decision, each moment laden with hope and dread. Finally, the day arrived. The small courtroom felt electric, filled with the townspeople's anxious energy. Henry clutched the arm of the chair, heart pounding in his chest. As the judge entered, all eyes turned to him. The whispers hushed instantly, the air thick with anticipation. Henry felt the weight of the moment, the collective heartbeat of the community resonating through the room. The judge leaned forward, eyeing the paperwork before him. After careful consideration, I find in favor of the community. Joy exploded, cheers breaking free as the tension that had hung over them dissipated like morning mist. Henry felt tears prick his eyes as he embraced the neighbor beside him, but it wasn't just relief. It was the exhilaration of standing strong against oppressive forces. Outside the courthouse, the air filled with laughter, relief, and celebration echoing across the fields they'd fought to protect. Henry gazed out at the landscape, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced uncertainty and doubt, but love for their home and community had guided them through. As Henry returned to his farmhouse, he could almost hear the laughter of children echoing through the fields, the whispers of generations past cheering them on. The developers might have underestimated them, but they hadn't understood the power of what it meant to call a place home. In the days that followed, the community thrived on the new energy, a restored sense of hope. The farmers began to collaborate more, sharing resources and knowledge, ensuring the legacy of their land blossomed for years to come. And at the heart of it stood old Henry Jenkins, a guardian of the farm, a symbol of resilience and courage. They thought they could take the farm, but they learned something powerful that day. Some battles are fought not just with strength, but with heart, unity, and an unwavering belief that home is worth fighting for. The sun dipped low in the sky, its golden rays filtering through the thick trees that bordered the old Jenkins farm. On this day, Henry Jenkins felt a foreboding chill despite the warmth. He leaned against the weathered wooden rail of his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, pondering the twists of fate that brought him here. Today felt different, almost electric. As he sipped the hot brew, a black SUV appeared at the end of his dirt road, dust swirling around its tires. Henry squinted, his heart racing with unease. This wasn't just any vehicle, it was a harbinger of trouble. The rumors had swirled in town, developers eyeing his land, hungry for every inch. And now it seemed they had come to call. The SUV rolled to a stop, and two sharply dressed men stepped out, confidence radiating from their polished shoes to their slick-back hair. Everything about them screamed corporate power. Henry's grip tightened on his mug, his instincts screaming for him to be ready. "Mr. the taller one called, approaching with a practiced smile. "We're with Greenfield Developments." "I'm not interested," Henry replied immediately, his voice steady. There wasn't a shred of doubt in him. The man's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, more forced now. "But sir, think of the investment opportunities. Your farm has incredible potential. We could turn this land into something extraordinary." Henry straightened his posture, a wave of indignation washing over him. "This land isn't just dirt to be sold. It holds my family's history, generations of sweat and toil." The second man, who stood back and observed, stepped in. "Let's be clear, Mr. Jenkins." Henry felt the sting of their arrogance. Every fiber in his being screamed to protect what was his. "You're not taking this farm from me." With that, he turned on his heel, determination surging through him. The men exchanged glances, their facade of confidence cracking as they retreated to their SUV. But Henry knew this was just the beginning. As night settled over the fields, Henry sat alone by his fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls which held stories of love, life, and loss. Memories flooded back, the laughter of children, the whispers of his late wife, and the dreams he had for the future. This farm was everything to him. The next day, he woke with renewed resolve. The sun rose slowly, spreading warmth across the land as he walked outside, absorbing the beauty of a new dawn. He wouldn't let this land slip into the clutches of greed without a fight. He started by gathering the community, the very heartbeats of this place, for a meeting in the old barn. Neighbors trickled in, some worried, others confused. They took their places on hay bales, a collective anxiousness in the air. "Listen, folks, we are facing a threat," Henry addressed them, his voice steady. "The developers want to take our land, not just mine, but all of ours." A murmur went through the crowd. Henry's neighbor, Martha, shared her concern. but they have money and power. Henry leaned in, eyes fierce. We fight back. We remind them that this isn't just land, it's our home. Gradually, resolve filled the barn. Farmers nodded, faces transforming from fear to determination. The spirit of camaraderie ignited. They began to share stories about their own connections to the land, weaving their histories into the fabric of a larger narrative. Days turned into weeks, and the small community transformed into a force fueled by determination. People shared stories on social media, making their fight public, but the developers had a well-oiled machine. Their slick advertising painted a picture of progress as townsfolk began to waver under the pressure. They held flashy meetings, promising jobs and growth, whispering sweet nothings of modernity into the ears of those they could sway. One evening, Henry gathered the community again, the tension palpable. They want to divide us. They want us to doubt our worth, our history, remember why we're fighting. A young girl named Lily stood up, her voice small but strong. My grandpa used to say that this land speaks. Henry felt a surge of hope, the kind that brightens the darkest paths. Exactly. We need to amplify our voices. Let's hold a rally. Excitement bubbled over, and they organized a day of protest, one that would not just resonate in their small town but echo through the hearts of others. Banners were painted, flyers distributed, and the energy shifted to one of empowerment. As the day of the rally approached, they braced themselves for the onslaught of the developers' tactics. Henry felt the nerves creep in, doubting whether they would stand against the well-funded machine. But when the day finally arrived, they gathered at the square, and the sheer number of people rallied around was breathtaking. Neighbors, families, even children stood shoulder to shoulder, united in purpose, as Henry spoke from a makeshift stage. This isn't just about one farm, it's about our way of life, our community. We are standing on the shoulders of generations. Cheers and applause erupted, the sound signaling a floodgate of courage. The sense of unity felt tangible, wrapping around them like a warmth that would shield against the winds of change. They held their banners high, voices lifted, faces determined. But as the crowd dispersed, a hushed dread filled Henry's heart. The developers were not fools, they would retaliate. Scattered threats rumbled through the town. The developers were enlisting the legal route, equipped with lawyers who thrived in the murky waters of corporate takeover. One rainy afternoon, the town gathered for what could be a pivotal meeting, faces grim, fear taking root. They sat in the town hall, tension heavy in the air, as lawyers droned on about legalities, contracts, and loopholes. Each word was a blow, chipping away at their resolve. At last, it was Henry's turn to speak. Swallowing hard, his voice broke through the fog of weariness. We may not have money or power, but we have each other, and that is something they can never take away. This is our land. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as eyes brightened with renewed determination. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing a tide of collective power. Days shifted into weeks, and the legal battle became exhausting. Papers piled up, meetings blurred into one another, and doubts began to creep back in. The developers' tactics grew aggressive. They hired private investigators to dig up dirt on community leaders, trying to find cracks in their armor. Henry felt the burden weighing heavily on him. He spent sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they could truly win. But during one of those restless nights, as he lay in bed, he thought of his grandfather. The stories of strong men and his family fighting for their lands flickered in his memory like fireflies. He rose before dawn and headed out to the fields, where the sun cast its first light. The stillness of the morning spoke to him, reassuring him that this land had endured far more than any corporate threat. He knelt in the dirt, feeling the cool earth beneath his fingers, and whispered promises to the ancestors whose whispers had guided him. "We will not let you down," he murmured, drawing strength from the land, from the roots that lay beneath. That day, he called for another gathering. "We may be tired, but we cannot weaken. They think they can break us, but we are tied to this earth, this community, and we are stronger than they realize." Together, they brainstormed new ways to defend their land, stepping up their public campaigns and inviting the media to cover their struggle. Stories of their fight began to spread beyond their small town. They became a symbol of grassroots resistance in an age of corporate advances. More people joined their cause. Voices echoed through the streets as neighboring communities rallied in support. A network formed, each branch reaching out to others who had faced similar struggles, sharing resources and strategies. In the following months, they organized educational events, sharing knowledge about farming practices, the importance of sustaining local agriculture, and how corporate farming systems could destroy the essence of what makes their community unique. But the developer's shadow loomed large in the distance. Even as triumph tickled the air, an underlying tension simmered. Fearing the worst, Henry prepared for another showdown. The day of reckoning came when the lawsuit was finally set for hearing. The town turned out en masse, hearts pounding in anticipation. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick, a classic David versus Goliath scenario, and Henry could feel every gaze resting on him, a desperate hope clinging to each collective breath. The developer's lawyers strode in with confidence, pressing hard with legal jargon that seemed to suffocate the room. Henry listened. Each word felt like a battle cry, but he remained focused. He would defend not just his farm, a piece of land, but the very essence of what it meant to belong. When it was finally Henry's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, sweeping his gaze across the crowd. "Your Honor, it's not just a matter of property lines or economic gain." His voice trembled, but it carried the weight of 1,000 voices. "We cannot afford to lose what makes us who we are. This land is a part of us." The judge paused, the room fell silent. Hope shimmered in everyone's eyes as they waited for a response. Days turned into an eternity, but finally the verdict came. In favor of the community, the judge's voice rang clear, startling away the doubt like thunder in a storm. It erupted into cheers. Tears flowed freely amidst laughter and hugs. Henry felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. They had won, not just for him, but for everyone who called this place home. The journey led by those tireless months echoed through Henry's heart as he soaked in the joy. The old farmhouse had weathered the storm, standing tall like a warrior, welcoming families to its embrace. In the weeks that followed, the town rallied to celebrate their victory. A massive picnic unfolded, where laughter and joy filled the air. Children ran freely as farmers shared stories over tables overflowing with food, each dish a reminder of the fruits of their labor, their unity, and their triumph. As Henry wandered through the crowd, he felt the warmth of connection and belonging wrap around him like a blanket. A familiar face approached him, the young girl, Lily. "Look, mister," she beamed, clutching a handful of wildflowers. "I planted these near your barn." With a gentle smile, he knelt down to her level, accepting the vibrant flowers. "Thank you, Lily. These are beautiful," he said, and for a moment he was reminded of his late wife and the way she used to cultivate beauty everywhere she went. Henry knew the battle was over for now, but the war would continue. New challenges would arise and new threats might emerge. Yet he was ready. With his community behind him, he felt invincible. They had built something stronger than any developer could take. They had forged a bond that would stand the test of time. In that moment, he realized that they had not just saved the farm, they had rediscovered their roots, their identity, and the strength found in community. They had proved that when those with heart unite against greed, they can hold on to their home and shape their destiny. As the evening sun set over the horizon, casting golden light over the fields, Henry breathed deep, feeling a profound sense of peace. They may have thought they could take the farm, but he was ready, and together they had fought fiercely for what they loved most. The land would continue to thrive, enriched not just by the soil but by the hearts of those who called it home. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the old Jenkins farm. Henry Jenkins leaned against the porch railing, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. Today was supposed to be like any other day. He didn't expect anything unusual, but a feeling churned in his gut, something foreboding and electric. And then he saw them. Two dark figures walking toward his gate, the crisp click of their shoes echoing on the gravel path. For a moment, their silhouettes blended with the shadows around the farmhouse, making them look like harbingers of trouble. The moment felt surreal, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. As they approached, Henry's heart quickened. The men wore tailored suits, their hair slicked back, expressions confident yet devoid of warmth. They looked like wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. Henry had seen a lot during his 70 years, but the sight of these men turned his gut to ice. "Mister," the taller man said. His voice was smooth, almost oily. "We're with Greenfield Developments." "I'm not interested," Henry replied, each syllable carrying the weight of firm resolve. The men exchanged glances, their smiles faltering momentarily. "But sir," the second man chimed in, "think of the potential. Your land could be transformed into a thriving commercial hub, a retail complex, perhaps." Henry felt a surge of anger. "This land isn't just a piece of property to me. It's my family's legacy. My father worked this land, my grandfather before him." The taller man stepped closer, a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Let's not be sentimental. We're talking about progress here. We can offer you a handsome sum." "Get off my property," Henry said, voice steady, a wall of defiance rising within him. Those words lingered in the air as the men retreated, but Henry knew this wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of a coming storm. Inside the farmhouse, the echoes of laughter from decades past bounced off the walls, mingling with shadows that danced in the flickering candlelight. Memories surged, the image of his late wife, smiling as she rolled out dough in the kitchen, the smell of fresh pies wafting through the air. The land wasn't just where they farmed. It was where they built their lives, a sacred space imbued with love. That night, sleep evaded him. Anxiety hung in the air like an oppressive fog, and the wind whispered warnings through the cracks of the house. Henry had always believed in the strength of family, the roots that anchored them to this land. But now those roots felt threatened and he had to act. The next day, he arranged a meeting in the old barn, inviting friends and neighbors, everyone who had a stake in the farm and the community. They gathered on hay bales, faces etched with concern. Henry could see doubt in their eyes. "Have a problem," he began, voice steady but urgent. "The developers think they can come in here, tear apart what we've built and profit from it, but this isn't just my fight." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, voices overlapping like gentle waves in a rising tide. Martha, a neighbor who had lived in the area for decades, broke the silence. "What can we do, Henry? They have money and power." Henry's resolve hardened. "If we stand together, we can show them the strength of our community. We can't let them divide us." As he spoke, people began to nod, leaning in closer. Together, they forged a plan to rally the community, to raise awareness of the threat looming over their land. They would take a stand, even if it felt like a David versus Goliath battle. Days turned into weeks, and word spread. Neighbors began sharing their connections, friends of friends who could help, media outlets willing to tell their story. The town began to buzz with determination, a spark igniting where doubt once festered. Before they knew it, the rally day arrived. It was a perfect spring morning. The sun beamed down like a warm embrace as families gathered in the town square. Henry stood at the front, a banner draped behind him. He called out, the crowd erupting in cheers. They marched through the heart of town, carrying their signs high, voices crying out in unison. The spirit of solidarity felt palpable, lifting them on a wave of hope. The energy swirled, a collective heartbeat buzzing with purpose. But the developers were not silent. Their reaction came swift and sharp. They sent letters filled with legal jargon, trying to intimidate the community. Henry felt the unease settle back in, creeping through the ranks like a quiet storm, threatening to pull them apart. Days later, as they gathered again, the lawyer from Greenfield Developments issued a warning. "You would be wise to reconsider your opposition. This is only a warning." Gathered in the town hall, Henry felt the weight of fear wash over them, clouding the bright hope they had built. "They want us to collapse under fear," he said firmly, cutting through the murmur of worry. "We can't let them win." His words struck a chord. Neighbors began speaking one by one, reaffirming their vows and calling for action. They vowed to come together, to not let the threats extinguish their passion. But one night, alone in his thoughts, Henry found himself questioning. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe they were right. Could they genuinely stand against a corporate giant? But then he remembered the laughter of children, the colors of the gardens, the stories spun over countless family dinners at that table. The next morning, a resolve blossomed anew. He arranged another gathering. The fire of their cause was still flickering, and he planned to make it blaze. "Let's plan not just to defend, but to educate the community." The meeting led to a series of community workshops. Neighbors brought in their experiences, their images of the past, and how the land had sustained them. They invited journalists to share stories, and slowly, the tide began to turn once more. But the developers entered another phase, mounting a sophisticated campaign filled with media ads promising growth and opportunity. "They know we're a threat. They're trying to dismantle our unity," Henry exclaimed in desperation during another town gathering. Every rally began to feel like an uphill battle. Support remained loyal, but the anxiety gnawed at their core. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Henry received a call from his daughter. She had seen the developers' ads and was worried about how people were falling to their tactics. "They're good, Dad. They paint such a pretty picture. It's hard for people to see through it," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "I know," he replied, gripping the phone tightly. "But we have to remind them of what is at stake." A glimmer of inspiration sparked in his mind. They decided to create an event, a farm day to gather everyone to showcase what they were fighting for. It would involve farming demonstrations, storytelling sessions, and sharing the heart and soul of the land. As the date neared, fear still loomed. The developers' slick campaign hovered above them like a dark cloud. But Henry pressed on, hopeful that the community would rise to the occasion. On Farm Day, the sun shone brightly, laughter bubbling over as residents ambled through the rows of crops, sharing stories of generations. Families came together, young and old, children darting between displays, soaking in all the beauty they had to offer. Henry stood at the heart of the festivities, resonating with the joyful energy around him. The love for the land felt evergreen, rippling in every heart. He said, voice ringing with pride. But even as they celebrated, the developers made their move. With a press release announcing their acquisition plans, they sought to diminish the event with a sense of impending doom. They proclaimed in all the right media channels. Yet Henry saw their desperation. They were scared. Their actions became increasingly erratic, revealing cracks in their armor. As rumors began to circulate about people from other towns interested in supporting Henry's cause, the tables turned. More community members began to rally. Local businesses joined ranks, offering support, revitalizing the message. This fight wasn't just theirs. It was for the soul of the entire area. The night before the next big meeting with the local council, Henry stood in his kitchen late into the hour, pondering all that had led them here. The weight of past battles loomed, yet dreams flickered, igniting sparks of hope. He reached for an old photograph of his family, taken on the porch years ago, capturing the love that stood through storms. It hit him. They were at a crossroads. He thought of his grandfather, who had worked this land with the grit and determination that had built this community. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that standing together was the backbone of their existence. The next morning, feelings of uncertainty gave way to a tide of burning resolve. They gathered in the local council chamber, a palpable energy filling the air. Henry took a deep breath as he looked around the room, seeing the steadfast faces of his friends, neighbors, and supporters. Today we stand not just for ourselves, but for the future of our children and their children. This land gives us life. It nurtures our families, he announced, voice ringing clear. We won't allow greed to tear us apart. His words echoed in the room. The community erupted in applause, a wave of energy surging through them. It was time to take control of the narrative. The developers had sent their legal team, but they would find themselves unprepared for the growing tide of opposition. Henry and his friends amassed countless stories, photographs, and testimonies to present, all the emotional and historical weight that spoke to their legacy. As the meeting unfolded, tension escalated. The developers presented their side, boasting about numbers and projections, but they couldn't capture the essence of what the land meant to its people. The moment arrived for Henry to speak again. He felt the eyes of his community behind him, urging him on. He passionately argued, "Take a look around. This isn't just soil, it's memories. It's generations breathing life into the very crops that sustain us." The room felt electric. As he spoke, people began to rise, fists clenched, exclaiming support. What unfolded was a dance of resistance, every voice amplifying the call. The council listened, the weight of their collective passion filtering through. And then came a pivotal moment. The council voted. Every heart pounded as the room held its breath, and the decision came in clear, ringing like a church bell on a Sunday morning. In favor of the community, the council leader declared, and a roar of jubilation erupted. Tears streamed down faces as despair lifted like morning mist, revealing the golden promise of a new day. As the crowd stormed out, embracing one another, chanting and celebrating, Henry stood back, overwhelmed with pride and gratitude. They had fought not just for the land, but for one another, for the bond that made them stronger together. The developers retreated in defeat, their plans crumbling like dry leaves. The community flourished, bolstered by love, determination, and unity. And Henry, standing on his porch, watched the sun set over fields rich with promise, knowing that together they had reclaimed their legacy. They thought they could take the farm, but they had underestimated something powerful. The heart of a community, unmoving, rooted deep in the soil where generations had grown, laughter had thrived, and hope had prevailed. Henry knew the fight had made them stronger, and as he sipped his coffee, he felt at peace, ready to watch the new chapters unfold on the land he loved. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old Jenkins farmhouse, a cold breath that sent chills deep into Henry's bones. It was a stormy Tuesday morning, the kind that wrapped the world in a gray haze. He stood by the kitchen table, pouring a cup of strong coffee, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled into his gut. It felt like the calm before a tempest. As he stirred the sugar, a loud knock echoed through the empty house, shaking him from his thoughts. Henry's heart raced as he wiped his hands on his apron, memories of the life he had built here flashing before him, his father tilling the fields, his late wife planting flowers by the porch. This wasn't just a farm, it was home. He opened the door to find two sharply dressed men standing on his porch, their polished shoes glistening in the light. They radiated an air of confidence, but it felt more like arrogance, sharp and menacing. One man held a briefcase, the other adjusted his tie, forcing a smile as if it could turn ice into warmth. "Mr. Jenkins," the taller man said, his voice smooth as butter, "we're with Greenfield Developments. We'd like to discuss your property." Henry felt a surge of anger rise within him, burning hotter than the coffee he had just brewed. "I'm not interested," he replied firmly, his voice steady. The men exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. "But Mr. Jenkins, think of the possibilities," the other man interjected, stepping a little closer. "We could transform this land into a thriving business center." Henry's hands balled into fists at his sides, a wave of protectiveness washing over him. "This land isn't just dirt to be sold. It's my family's history, my father's legacy." For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The men's confidence wavered as they took in the old farmhouse behind him, its weathered charm and sprawling fields that whispered stories of generations. Finally, the taller man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Let's be clear, Mr. Jenkins. We aren't asking for your permission. We're informing you that we plan to acquire this land." Henry felt the ground shift beneath him, yet every instinct in his body screamed that this was a fight worth having. He stood tall, years of hard work coursing through his veins. "You can't just take what isn't yours." With that, Henry slammed the door shut, the finality echoing in his chest. He drew in a breath, the reality settling like lead in his stomach. He knew how these things went. It was a game played by people with money and power. He had heard stories of farmers losing their land to developers, their lives uprooted overnight. But Henry wasn't going to be one of those stories. The day stretched long, the clouds rolling in darker and thicker, matching the tumult of his thoughts. He picked up the phone and began to call his neighbors, each ring a reminder of the community that had sustained him through thick and thin. One by one, he explained what was happening. "We need to stand together," he said, his voice resolute. The next evening, a crowd gathered in the barn, old wooden beams creaking above them. Henry stood at the front, the firelight flickering in their eyes as he felt the weight of their expectations. "They think they can just come in here and take what we've built, but we are stronger than they realize." Murmurs of agreement rose, tension rippling through the room like a current. Martha, his fierce neighbor, stepped forward, her face set in determination. We can fight back. We'll organize rallies, get the community involved. And just like that, a spark ignited. They worked late into the night, crafting signs and slogans, pouring their hearts into every brushstroke. Became the rallying cry, echoing through the fields and the hearts of the people who called this land home. Weeks rolled on and the tension mounted. They held meetings in town, their voices growing louder, more unified. The men from Greenfield returned, cloaked in disdain, trying to sow distrust among the community. "You're wasting your time," they sneered, their arrogance palpable. But the community had rallied around Henry, and one by one, they began to rise against the tide of intimidation. Then came the day of the rally, a bright Saturday morning, the sun beaming down as families flocked to the town square, carrying handmade signs in a fervor that felt like fire. Henry stood at the podium in front of the crowd, his heart swelling with pride and purpose. "This isn't just about me or my farm," he called, voice strong and clear over the din. "It's about all of us. It's about standing up for what we believe in." Cheers erupted, voices rising in a wave of support, a symphony of resistance against the looming darkness. Children played nearby, laughter ringing out, while neighbors shared stories that wove their lives into a tapestry of shared history. But the battle was far from over. The developers struck back hard. They launched a smear campaign, painting Henry and the community as obstacles to progress. Their ads plastered across the newspapers promised jobs, prosperity, and growth, everything they claimed the town needed. Gradually, whispers of doubt began to circulate. Some began to murmur. Henry felt the unsteady ground beneath him again. That evening, he gathered the townsfolk in the barn once more. When he stood before them, the weight of their eyes left him vulnerable yet unbroken. "I know they offer attractive promises," he said, voice steady. "It's easy to be swayed by shiny new things, but what we have here is irreplaceable." The crowd listened, uncertainty creasing their faces. A hand shot up. It was Lily, a young girl with bright eyes and a determined spirit. "My grandpa taught me that land speaks. If we let them take it, it goes quiet." Her words ignited something deep within the gathered crowd. Suddenly, they felt the fire reignite, stoked by the very essence of what they were protecting. Days turned into a blur as they rallied for support, crossing paths with other towns facing similar struggles. They crafted plans, petitions, and strategies. The unity woven between them grew stronger than any developer could comprehend. But behind the scenes, Henry could feel the tightening noose of fear. The developers, sensing the resolve was growing, escalated their tactics, employing legal threats that unnerved even the strongest among them. Fear gripped his heart like a snake, squeezing tighter and tighter. They arrived at town hall for a crucial meeting, but not without a plan. The air felt electrified as they gathered, but the chamber was packed with tension, the palpable sense of anxiety echoing through the wooden beams. As the council entertained the developers' polished rhetoric, making promises of growth and numbers, Henry felt his heart pound in his chest. He could feel every eye in the room focused on him. Everyone held their breath, waiting for him to take a stand. He stood up, grounding himself in the history of their community, letting sincerity seep into his words. "This isn't just a land deal for you. This is our life, our families. Our children's future hangs in the balance here." His voice cracked and vulnerability seeped through, bringing forth emotion not just from him but from those seated around him. The developers labeled him a hindrance, but his words resonated deeply. Behind the council table, tension mounted. The developers knew they had underestimated him. Days passed in a blur of fear and anticipation. The gathering storm loomed as they faced the impending decision on their fate. Henry spent long nights wide awake, echoing doubts bouncing around his mind. What if they lost? What would happen to the community that had built its identity on this land? Then came the day of the judgment, the air thick with tension as they gathered in the town hall. Henry felt the weight of years of farming, of blood, sweat, and dreams bearing down on him. The council sat weighty before him, the atmosphere crackling like a thunderstorm ready to unleash its fury. With every word the mayor spoke, anticipation gripped the room tighter and tighter. The decision would shape their future. It hung in the balance like a pendulum waiting to swing. And then it came. The verdict echoed through the chambers, rippling a wave of relief. The community stands together against the acquisition. Euphoria erupted, drowning out the fear that had gripped their hearts for so long. They rose together as one, embracing the sweet taste of victory, tears flowing freely, laughter filling the room like music. Henry felt the joy pulsing through him, breathtaking and profound as they hoisted signs high above their heads. As days turned into weeks, the pain from that struggle began to fade. They continued to work the land, fueled by a conviction that was born from their fight. The community grew even tighter, farmers collaborated, kids played together in the fields, and friendships blossomed in the warm summer sun. Henry watered the crops that lined the fields, watching as life thrived and hope flourished. The bond that had deepened during the fight propelled them into a future that felt brighter than ever. Yet, in the corners of his mind, he remained vigilant. The developers wouldn't just walk away quietly. On a particularly bright afternoon, as Henry prepared to harvest, a figure appeared at the edge of the field. The same suited men ambled forward with that same arrogant confidence, but this time they had their entire legal team in tow, lawyers who had been lurking in the shadows. "Mr. Jenkins," the tall man said, voice slick like oil, "we're here to discuss your options again." Henry's heart raced and anger bubbled to the surface, hot and unyielding. He remembered the whispers of his ancestors, the fortitude that ran through his blood. "You will never take this land from me or my community." "But you don't understand," the lawyer interjected, newfound desperation creeping into his voice. "We'll take this as far as it needs to go. We've already decided that this is worth fighting for," Henry shot back, feeling an electric thrill at the energy and unity around him. The men retreated, their grins faltering as they realized the resolve of the community that now surrounded Henry. Hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, the people who lived in the surrounding lands were ready for whatever might come next. In the following weeks, they fortified their defenses, sharing legal resources, community planning, and stories that reaffirmed their stance. They held more rallies, drew in supporters from far and wide, reminding everyone what it meant when a community stood together. The summer carried them forward, the air thick with determination. They spread their message widely, showing the world what true strength looked like, emphasizing the power of local agriculture, the importance of preserving their heritage, and being a tight-knit community determined to save their home. As fall approached, Henry stood on his porch one evening, watching the trees swirl with the colors of autumn. In the calm, he felt the warmth of unity around him, a realization that they had not just won a battle, they had forged strong bonds that could weather any storm. They had taught the developers that attached to this land was something immeasurable, a fierce love that couldn't be bought or sold. They recognized that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones you expect, but rather the ones shaped by heart and the unwavering will to protect what you love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the fields, Henry breathed deeply, feeling peace settle within him. They may have thought they could take the farm, but they had underestimated the spirit of the old man who stood tall, ready to defend all he held dear. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the Jenkins farm. Henry Jenkins stood on his porch, coffee in hand, savoring the quiet before the day began. But something felt off. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with an energy he couldn't quite name. Just then, the sound of a car's engine rumbled down the dirt road, disrupting the serenity of the morning. The vehicle pulled up to his gate, a shiny black SUV that looked out of place against the backdrop of his weathered barn and sprawling fields. Henry's heart began to race. He set his mug down and squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out the figures inside. Two sharply dressed men stepped out, confidence oozing from their every move. Henry's instincts kicked in, a nagging voice urging him to be ready. He had lived on this farm for over 40 years, and he wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. "Mister," the taller one called, striding toward him as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. Henry replied, bracing himself for what was undoubtedly coming. "We're here on behalf of Greenfield Developments," the man said, a thin smile creeping across his face. "We'd like to discuss your property with you." Henry could feel a surge of anger building within him. He asked, each word dripping with skepticism, The second man chimed in, his tone manipulative yet smooth. "Think of the possibilities, Mr. Jenkins. This farm could be transformed into a commercial hub, a shopping complex, perhaps. Jobs created, tax revenue increased." Henry felt his fists clenching at his sides. "This land isn't just dirt to be sold. It's my home. My family built this farm from the ground up." The men exchanged glances, their confident demeanor momentarily tarnished. The taller man stepped forward, leaning closer as if sharing a secret. "Let's cut to the chase. We're prepared to make you a generous offer." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Henry felt a mixture of fear and resolve wash over him. "I'm not interested in your offers. This farm is not for sale." The men hesitated, their faces darkening as if they had been dealt a crushing blow. But with a curt nod, they returned to their vehicle, the engine roaring to life as they sped away, leaving Henry standing alone on the porch, hearts racing, anger boiling. He turned back toward the house and sank into a creaky old chair on the porch, the weight of the confrontation settling over him like a heavy blanket. The generations of farmers who tended to this land whispered their stories in his ears, reminding him that he had a legacy to uphold. As dusk approached, Henry decided it was time to fight back. He picked up the phone and called his neighbors, summoning them to gather in the old barn that had witnessed so many family stories and heartfelt conversations. The next evening, the barn pulsed with energy as familiar faces filled the space. Farmers, teachers, and tradespeople, the lifeblood of the community. Henry took a deep breath, surveying the room as he stepped up onto a makeshift stage. "Folks," he began, his voice steady but passionate, "we have a threat at our doorstep." A murmur of apprehension rippled through the crowd. He could see their worry reflected in their eyes. A woman named Martha stood up, freckles dancing across her cheeks. "What can we do, Henry?" Henry met her gaze, determination lining his features. "What they don't have is our love for this land. We need to come together." As discussions ignited, ideas flowed, rallies, petitions, social media campaigns. The energy shifted, transforming fear into a palpable sense of purpose. They worked late into the night, drafting flyers and organizing an upcoming rally to raise awareness. Days became weeks as they poured their hearts into preparations. Henry could feel the house buzz with a new energy, a collective determination that was contagious. The energy was electric as Henry stood at the forefront, swept away by the conviction of those around him. "This isn't just my fight," he shouted, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is our home." Cheers erupted and the emotion swelled, transforming fear into a unified roar that echoed through the town. But the developers weren't finished yet. Their retaliation came swift and ruthless. They unleashed a smear campaign, casting doubt upon Henry and his community. Articles popped up in local newspapers, branding them as obstacles to progress, warning of economic decline. The town began to waver, whispers of doubt spreading like wildfire. Late at night, in the dim light of his living room, Henry sat piecing together the events, his heart heavy. He wondered. In the throes of that doubt, he decided to gather the community once more. The barn filled again, the air thick with anxiety. "They want us to turn on each other," Henry said, standing before the crowd. "But we have to remember why we're doing this." The resolve in his voice cut through the darkness, igniting a spark that rippled through the crowd. Slowly, voices emerged, each person sharing their own connection to the land. "My father taught me how to farm here," one man shared. Lily, the bright-eyed young girl who had already spoken out, raised her hand again, her small voice firm. "My grandpa says the trees talk. If we let them take the farm, the trees will go quiet." And just like that, it clicked. They began to brainstorm strategies, planning not just for their fight, but also to educate their neighbors about the value of local agriculture and the heartbeat of their community that couldn't be replaced by concrete and greed. But when the dust settled, the developers struck back harder. With legal paperwork thick as a novel, they threatened lawsuits and delays, trying to entangle the residents in their web of bureaucracy. The strain was palpable and tension crackled through the gathered crowd like electricity. A voice quivered from the back. Henry felt the panic rising, hope was slipping away. He took a deep breath, searching for a way to rally them. "We might not have money, but we have the truth, and that's worth fighting for," he said, steel in his voice. "Let's organize a town hall meeting. We'll share our stories." The idea brought renewed energy, and they began working relentlessly to prepare for the town hall. Every moment felt like a race against time. On the fateful day, the community gathered, tension heavy in the air as they filed into the room. Henry could feel every heartbeat, every breath as the room filled with anticipation. He took his place among the crowd, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The developers stood at the front, sleek and polished, but their bravado felt thin. Henry stood and spoke, presenting the stories that filled the room. These fields have fed families for generations. The developers countered with numbers and facts: vacancies in the area, opportunities for growth. But their reasoning felt hollow next to the raw emotion that enveloped the community. One by one, community members stepped forward to share their stories, their voices resonating powerfully. The room grew alive with emotion, and with each confession came a sense of unity. Henry could feel the tide shifting. Hope surged within him. But just when he thought they had the upper hand, the mood flipped in an instant. The developer's lawyer launched a direct attack, accusing Henry and his friends of being anti-progress. "You're holding back the town." The lawyer shouted, the accusation echoing off the walls. Henry felt the air thicken around him, uncertainty creeping in. He stood at the edge of a battlefield, the echoes of accusation swirling like a storm. But just then, a familiar face entered the room. It was Martha, her eyes sharp, clutching a piece of paper. "I couldn't stay silent," she said, voice quaking with urgency. "I have news about the developers' funding. It's not as solid as they claim." The weight of her words filled the room with fresh energy. Renewed determination washed over them. The crowd murmured excitement, but Henry felt a measure of uncertainty. Could they really turn the tide? He had a plan forming in his mind, a counterattack that would expose the truth. The old men of the town had built a trench of brotherhood around the farm, but now it remained pivotal against the encroaching threat. But as the evening wore on, another figure emerged from the shadows. The mayor stepped up, a calculating smile twisting his lips. "Listen, folks," he said, oozing charm. "I think we need to consider the facts the developers are presenting." Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief flooding Henry's senses. The mayor, a man he'd trusted, was hinting at selling out his own community. The tension reached its peak, and anger ignited among the residents. Someone shouted, disbelief fueling the fire. In that moment, Henry felt exposed, fatigue and doubt swirling in his mind. This was a fight for his home, his community. "We need to stand firm," he said, stepping forward to face the encroaching storm. "This is our fight, our land." The uproar grew, and it felt like the fabric of their community was hanging by a thread. That was when Henry noticed the developers whispering among themselves, their confident smiles replaced with concern as they began to huddle closer. Were they feeling the pressure? Were cracks beginning to show? Sensing his opportunity, Henry leaned in closer. "Let's make a stand," he declared, heart pounding. "We can expose their lies, their weaknesses." The meeting turned into a chaotic storm of voices, but beneath the chaos was a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed with resolve. The crowd began to chant, voices rising in unison, echoing the strength of their commitment. Henry knew they were at a pivotal moment, their collective spirit converging into a force that could either break or uplift them. As the gathered community began to yield their strength, the weight of the impending battle hung heavy. But Henry felt a frost creeping in, a chill coating their rallying cries. The invocation of fear and doubt pressed down as the developers leaned back, seasons of business maneuvering coursing through their veins. With the strength of the community behind him, Henry felt the clang of uncertainty recede. But just as he opened his mouth to shout the next rallying cry, a sharp clarity struck. Suddenly, everything shifted. The crowd fell silent, every face etched with uncertainty. The developers exchanged knowing glances, and Henry's heart raced as he realized the precariousness of their position. Time seemed to stretch, the air crackling with an unseen tension that teased the edges of resolve. They were on a knife's edge. Could this be the moment they had all been waiting for? Would their collective breath be drawn into silence as they worked through this newfound tension? Henry's heart pounded. The community, once bound tightly together, suddenly felt like a tapestry torn at the seams. He peered into the crowd, searching for familiarity in the shifting tides of fear and doubt. Then slowly, he stepped forward once more and raised his voice above the murmur. "This is not just about land," he cried, desperation lacing his tone. "This is about our spirits. It's about what we will allow ourselves to be defined by." As he spoke, a deep silence ensued, every heart hanging on his words. But just as hope began to flicker again, the room erupted into chaos, opposing voices clanging against the air. Will they take a step back? Will they surge forward? The tension reached its peak, the room crackling as loyalties splintered, and Henry stood there at the center of it all, feeling the very earth shift beneath him, unsure of what might happen next. The developers watched with satisfaction, sensing victory inching closer, as Henry's heart raced against an uncertain future. But just as the uproar reached its zenith, the lights flickered overhead, plunging everything into darkness. Gasps echoed, confusion swirling through the crowd as whispers of uncertainty grew louder. In that moment, a single beam of light illuminated Henry's face as he steeled himself, determined not to lose faith in his community. But with shadows creeping in, the fear was palpable. Would he hold the line? Would this fractured unity prove stronger than they realized? As the tension crackled in the darkness, Henry stood ready to face whatever storm lay ahead. Everything he loved was hanging in the balance. In that flickering light, he felt the weight of generations standing behind him. And as the next moment unfolded, everything hung in the balance, ready to shift, ready to break, ready to ignite a battle that would mark their place in history forever.